So let's begin at the beginning with the context behind what makes you a little bit different than other people.
I mean, from the biological markers, I am. But I think if you met me,
which I have and can attest, you are an amazing, gregarious, wonderful man. Yes.
You'd say, usually people's response is like a regular guy. And I've always felt like a regular guy. I still have my Teamster's card. I was a bartender and a truck driver, a laborer, did all those things and enjoyed them. And I also taught almost every grade, and I still do. And in medical school. So meeting people, when we go out, people think I'm and if they don't know me, they'll say, well, he's kind of like a smart truck driver or bartender. I say, well, I am. That's true. That's what I am.
Who just happens to be a, emeritus neuroscience professor.
Well, yeah, but that's another sort of life that's just purely cognitive, and it's not like regular life. So there's a large part of me which is very regular. You do have that with people with psychopathic traits, right? Like I do. I have, I'm really right on the borderline of being a full psychopath. I score usually the mid-high 20s in the hair test and the equivalent in the PPI, the Psychopathic Personality Inventory. But I don't have any negative. I have almost all the positive symptom traits and very few of the negative ones. No criminality. I have no desire to hurt people. I do, which I didn't know, but I do, because I, manipulate people. But for me, it's just a game, like a cat with a mouse. And but that's stuff I just found out, recently over past few years.
Let's move the audience forward and let's tell them the story of how you discovered that you were a psychopath. That you had psychopathic neurobiology.
I had been studying, we did a lot of studies, PET scans, fMRI, genetic studies on schizophrenia, addictions, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's disease, a lot of psychiatric and neurological disorders for years. My basic, I had two labs that were basic neuroscience labs having to do with growth factors and adult stem cells and the mapping out of chemical systems in the brain, hormonal systems. So there was that part, but then there was also working with my psychiatry colleagues. And for that, we were doing, like I said, PET scans and genetics and putting these together in a mathematical or statistical format. So you could take differences in the brain activation patterns of, let's say, a PET scan or an fMRI, different brain areas, associate those with all the genetic alleles that the person had, the forms of the genes that the person had, and then put that together with their psychometrics, all their psychological testing, their, how different personality traits and different positive and negative traits they had. And we created a mathematical model. And we did that back in the early mid 2000s rather, not 20s. And so our group, starting about 1999, we really were the first ones, our consortium, to do individual or personalized medicine for psychiatry. I'm pretty sure we had the first group who did that. And we are also able to reduce the number of people that you need to test because of the statistics and the way we design the experiments to lower the number from 3,000 to 40 people. It just saved a lot of money. And so we were looking for that because we were trying to find ways mostly to really characterize people with different kinds of schizophrenia, different kinds of bipolar, different kinds of Alzheimer's, or different kinds of dementia. And because there's all of these disorders and diseases are on spectrum. They're on a spectrum and they're all different types. There's many kinds of schizophrenia. So we wanted to define when patients came in by using these combined imaging and genetic and psychometric testing, and to say this is exactly the type you have, and we know with you that you may benefit from this very specific drug or any number of other 20 combinations, or better yet, if with some talk therapy instead of drugs. But some people may respond, for example, to light therapy for depression. And then there's some people that are completely resistant that are candidates for surgery, brain surgery, to remove those areas that are overactive, like, for example, in depression. So it's a whole spectrum of those, sorts of ways of looking at it and treating them. So that was how that was motivated since the 90s. I started doing brain imaging analysis with my colleagues. They were actually my medical students that I taught neuroscience to back in the, mostly in the late 70s and 80s. And then now they're, psychiatrists and radiologists and neurologists. And I taught them neuroscience. So they came back when we got a PET scanner, positron emission tomography scanner. And we had a good one, a really high resolution one. And they were, doing tests, and they would bring it to me and say, what do you see? What's the brain circuitry you see? Does this look familiar? And I still do that with them to this day. But one small part of that was testing murderers. These were serial killers, like really bad murders. And it was usually during the penalty phase of their trial that they came in to get a PET scan, because at that point they wanted to say, show that the devil made them do it, that it was some organic disorder, not their
My brain made me do it.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's when we did them, and I would then, I was one of the people who analyzed those. And that started like 1989, but I only got like one or so a year. And it wasn't until about 2005 at that point I got a lot of scans of murders from different people using different modalities. The PET scans, fMRI, SPECT scans. And so I told them, I said, just don't tell me what I'm looking at. Mix up the population with normal people, schizophrenics, et cetera, to confuse me. So I don't know they're murderers. I don't know what they're. And after I did this, I was, really surprised, because nobody had really come up with a unifying scheme for a psychopath. Now, of course, not all murderers are psychopaths, but of those people with psychiatric disorders, they form the highest percentage of murderers. There are also impulsive murderers. There are disorganized ones. There are people who had fetal alcohol syndrome, or, their mother was a drug addict or an alcoholic. And they, some of those people murdered. Some people with schizoaffective disorder, which is in the schizoaffective, that's what some shamans have. There's always somebody in a population, in a clan or tribe, that schizoaffective, and they're usually the ones that are made shaman.
Because they can hear things.
They hear things and see things. Sometimes they're right, so and they tell good stories. So they're good to have around the campfire at night. So they're very pervasive and very ancient, probably hundreds of thousands of years old in human society. And so, at any rate, so in studying these, so I came up and I saw a pattern. I said, oh my God! So I started talking about it. Then I wrote a paper on it, and at that point, it was something new, because nobody had ever come up with this idea of the overall pattern, the fundamental pattern for a psychopath. And so my work did that, even though I wasn't doing it on a regular basis. You know what I mean? It was on the fly. It just happened to do it. So
what did you see? What was the pattern that you saw in the brains?
Well, the pattern is that in the functional brain scans, you see reduced activity when you show somebody something that should get them really upset. For example, very highly emotionally charged things. It could be a bus full of children burning or some really awful stuff, or people decapitated. And when a normal person sees that, certain areas of the brain really fire up. The amygdala, this whole limbic system, the cortical limbic system that connects from the amygdala through the insula, loops into the orbital cortex. It's the orbital because it's above the orbits of the eye. So it's at the base of the prefrontal cortex. And those areas and the part along the midline, the ventromedial cortex, they connect with the amygdala through this uncinate fasciculus, which is shaped like a C right here. And it turns out that all the psychopaths, that was turned off, that whole system. So I said, I know what the system is. It's like a basic cortical limbic system is turned off in these people. And I wrote about it. So that was, I think, the first description of this in any literature of the entire loop. People have found that people with orbital cortex damage had, you'd see like a pedophile or people who were murderers, but not the whole system. And I was able to reconstruct that entire thing, which people followed up within several years and really did the study well. I was on the fly. I just happened to be doing that. And so that pattern in 2005, 2006 I was vetting in different psychiatry departments, psychology departments, law schools, you name it, to see, how this sounded to people and how, how to do, did it resonate and was it done well? And at the same time, we were doing our real work, which is we were trying to find the genes, the forms of genes, the genetic alleles that are associated with Alzheimer's disease. It was known that the ApoE gene, one of the variants, you can have the, you get alleles of each gene, one from your mother, one from your father. And usually with each of one of these genes, there's one of those alleles that is high functioning, one is low functioning. And it's kind of a casino, roll of the dice, what you inherit from your mother and father. You can inherit 2 4s, a 4 and a 3, a 3 and a 3, a 2 and a 3, and a 2 and a 2. Well, it turns out with the ApoE, if you inherit a 4 you're in trouble. That's highly risky for Alzheimer's. A 2 you never get. You never get Alzheimer's. It's protective. And then there are combinations. So there are people with 3 3s, 3 4s, but there seemed to be something missing. So we went hunting for those genes or genes and we found it. We ended up, I'll just cut to the chase. We found it in this study. It's called TOM40, TOMM40. And that was the gene that interacts with the ApoE. So it can turn the system on or off. So we were at the end of the experiment and we had all of our Alzheimer's patients done. We just didn't have enough control. So I told, we had to quickly find the controls. This was a clinical study we were doing. And so instead of recruiting people, which could have taken, maybe a month or two, I said, look, I'll get my family. I mean, it was not the greatest idea, but they were there. And so I asked, our kids, my wife and my brothers to, the ones that were here, they flew out to do the PET scan for it, have their gene analysis done and the psychometrics done, with the idea that none of us had Alzheimer's, so we're good controls. But my wife's family had a lot of Alzheimer's, so she was at risk to take this. But she said, the hell with it, well, let's do it. And then everybody, the kids and grandkids, will find out if they are susceptible, and they can change their diet and their lifestyle maybe to delay the onset if it looked like you're at risk. So she was kind of heroic. And she said the reason she agreed to it is because some years before, about 6 years before, she got non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, had a tremendous size tumor all through her abdomen, her chest, or into her arms and legs. It was enormous. Mm-hmm. And we were really, really quite concerned about that. But the good news there is she had it treated. She did all the right things. She'd have somebody come down and do qigong on her and or herbs, and you name it. She did everything, regular science, Eastern science, and alternative, everything. She's a good patient, and she beat it, and it has not come back. But at the time, this is 18 years later, it's never got come back. So this story ends well. But at the time, we didn't know. And she just said, look, let's find out if I've got the genes and the early brain changes of Alzheimer's. And she said, besides, I'm going to die of lymphoma before I die of Alzheimer's. She kind of sense of humor she has. And so we did this. And at the same time, I had finished up the scans of the murder. So they're completely separate studies. And I had the pile of these murder scans on my desk. And then the 2 technicians came into my office and they said, we got your family's Alzheimer's scans done. So I took them and I quickly leafed through the pile of the scans. They're printed out and you can see the reds and the blues and the yellows are just kind of coded. If the areas of the brain are red, they're higher than normal or higher than a drug or higher than the controls. And if they're orange, they're still higher. And if they're yellow, kind of in the middle, same with green, and then blue, colder, things are kind of turned off, right? So by looking at these, I've seen so many over the years of these PET scans and fMRIs that I can quickly tell if something's grossly abnormal. When I got through the pile, it was 8 of them, or 7 or 8, and they all looked normal. So I was like so relieved. And then I got to that last.
No Alzheimer's, yeah, that's a big deal.
Yeah. So yeah, it was a big deal because none of them looked like they had Alzheimer's. And when the genetics came back sometime later, it was the same thing. People had a mix of these protective genes and resistant genes. And so there was no big deal there either, which is, very good news for my wife and really for everybody, for the kids. And so Then I got to the bottom, the last scan in this pile of my family's Alzheimer's scans, and I looked at it, and I started laughing. I said, "Okay, guys," to the technicians, I said, "You took one of the murderers, right? You took one of the psychopaths out of the machine, and you printed it out. And now you tell me it's somebody in my family." And they go, "No. It's really just part of your family." I said, "This is somebody that should be locked up, probably. You know, is of danger to society." And so,
based on how the brain looked.
Yeah, they said, "No, absolutely not." They said, "This is for real." I said, "No, you got to be kidding." So at that point, I had to take the name off because I never know who I'm looking at. It was covered with tape, so I took the tape off, and boom, there it was my name. So there was Gandalf showing up at my door, and that's how I found out that something might be wrong. But when I saw it, I just laughed. And my first thought was, I know who I am, and my theory must be wrong. These areas that I thought were involved are probably not involved. My theory's wrong because I'm okay. Never thought I was a psychopath. And so that was my first, sort of sense. I thought it was funny, and I got the joke. It's like, okay, a neuroscientist studying psychopathic killers and finds out he's got the brain pattern. And then later the genetics, I mean, really quite quirky and serendipitous of a psychopath. And so the joke was on me, but I seriously did not even, I didn't give it a second thought. And we were at that time, I was raising $7 million for an adult stem cell company based on the research I was really doing, our lab was doing. We had some wonderful discoveries on how to stimulate indwelling endogenous brain stem cells in cases of injury. So we're using it for models of Parkinson's and chronic stroke. That's really what I was interested in. This other thing was just completely a tertiary issue of just quirky, it didn't even bother me. I didn't think of it. And so I, raising that money and then starting that company and finishing up the patents and the papers for the schizophrenia and the Alzheimer's study. That's really, so I didn't even, people have asked me over the years, didn't it shock you? And I said, no. I said, we're doing other stuff. I didn't take it seriously. And, it's like, okay, so what? Move on. That was my reaction. But it was years later when I was asked to give a talk in Norway. It was sponsored by the University of Oslo. And I was asked to give the talk with the ex-prime minister of Norway. And he, in his first term, found out he had bipolar disorder, and he admitted it, which is incredible for a European, especially like a Norwegian. They never admit anything like that. In the United States, people tell you anything. You go into a bar and they'll tell you, the affairs they're having. They'll tell you, I got cancer, I got the, they're very open about it here. But there, it's, oh my God, you never say it. But he was willing to talk about it. So I thought that was great. So I said, yeah, I'll give the science talk with him, with his personal story, and then somebody doing a, clinical story. So I gave that talk, and it was 2009. This was several years after finding these scans. And at the end of that talk, where I talked about how we determine the genes involved with different disorders, right? PET scan, genetics, and mathematical model, the guy stood up, and it turned out to be the chairman of the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Oslo. And he goes, well, thanks for that talk. That was nice. And so I got two things to tell you. First of all, you yourself have bipolar disorder and you don't know it. You're really probably a borderline psychopath too. He said you're hypomanic. So you qualify for bipolar. He said you don't get depressed, but bipolar is not defined by the depression. It's defined by the mania or hypomania. And people with hypomania never want to cure it because it feels so good. You're always in a good mood, kind of up, and there's a kind of pressure of speech. Like you can hear me, like right now, you probably want to say, "Would you slow down and shut up a little?" But it's this it's this being in a very positive sort of zone in your life all the time, and they could see that, but secondly, they said you probably are a borderline psychopath as well. That's when
okay, that's when the penny drops, yeah.
Yeah, well, that was the first time I ever took it seriously at all, this whole issue. So when I went back, I asked my wife, I said, look, I'm not going to get mad. Tell me what you really, really think of me. Now, I've known her a long, long time. And we were 12 years old on our first date. We were each other's first dates at 12 years old. And then we became friends, and we were quite young and active. We both loved to dance and both loved to, we were competitive swimmers and we liked to play together. But there was no real romance, although we were attracted to each other. There was like a completely sexless existence we led, but we could kind of really dug each other. And I liked her because she thought in a way that I could never access. And I knew that immediately. And the big draw was she thought she was so different than anybody. And she's still the most different person I know. So we're going to have our 50th wedding anniversary next month. So we've actually been dating for about, it's like 60 years or something.
Amazing. So this woman knows you.
And so she really knows me. It's hard to pull anything over on her at all. So this doesn't fit a psychopath pattern. Psychopaths aren't married 50 years and going out with the same girl for that. They just don't do it. So it didn't look like, it's not one of the things. And I've also had the same job. I always knew I wanted to be a scientist from the time I was a kid. And I've been, really successful and in a straight line through all my training. And I've had a wonderful career, a completely enjoyable, successful career as a scientist. So this idea of having a very steady, productive career and never been arrested, and with the same woman, I got kids and I have grandkids, and kind of happy family guy. So this doesn't sound like psychopathy, but I went around asking everybody, my wife and then my brothers and my sister and, my friends. And I have a lot of friends who are psychologists, especially psychiatrists, but they all said, well, you're a great guy. You're great to hang out with, but you do psychopathic things that are not right. They all said the same thing. I said, what? I said, what are you talking about?
And also, why didn't anybody tell you until now?
Yeah, well, it's always, oh, Jim, you're crazy. And they said, no, we didn't say you're crazy. You're not crazy. You do psychopathic things. Then I had to ask the psychiatrists I know well, who've known me for years. And I asked them the same thing. And they said, oh, you definitely, so we've been telling you for years, you do psychopathic things. You have a lot of psychopathic traits. And I said, you've told me this? They said, yeah, but you never put it together, which I never did. You hear these things separately. It's a banquet, but they all get blended together. But once, I heard all of it, they all said the same thing. Except my mother. She said, no, you've always been a nice boy. But then, she just died last year. She lived to 102. Wow. And in the past few years, she said, well, I got to tell you really what I think of you. And so
once the frontal lobe starts to thin a little bit and the inhibition wheedles away,
well, it was quite,
the truth comes out.
After all this was, had been through the cleaner, she finally said, when you were going into puberty, we're really concerned about you for a number of things. You get very dark, and it was always, starting when I was about 10 or 11, 12, there was always an adult, and it happens to this day, some adult who was a teacher, a professor, a priest, a rabbi, somebody, a psychologist, who said there's something really wrong with you. You can't put the finger on it, but there's something really evil about you. And I always heard this and just laughed it off. But I to this day, I get the same thing. And people can never put their finger on it. And so that was always in the background, and I never paid any attention. I absolutely laughed it off. But one psychiatrist, he said, you've heard all of this stuff. You've been tested and everything. How do you feel? I said, I don't give a shit. He goes, that's the problem. You really, truly don't care. And so that was I guess the denouement of all of that is like, you have all these traits and consistently shown those traits. Anybody who knows anything about psychology and psychiatry all agree that I have this, but I'm not a categorical clinical psychopath. I'm short of that. So I'm like one of these borderline guys, like Bill Clinton, or, is the greatest case of the borderline psychopath. It's got all positive traits. And, there's a whole group of these two groups of traits, positive and negative, in both the Hare psychopathy system and the PPI,
Hold on. How is Bill Clinton a psychopath? I haven't heard this theory.
Oh, he does everything. Everything. It's all the sweet talking manipulation. He doesn't even think it's wrong. He's not. He really. It's like that isn't wrong. Everybody knows around him what he does. A complete scoundrel, and yet he's like, well, that's not wrong, and he means it. And it's like, it's what psychopaths do. And they're just always on the make, always constantly manipulating, and manipulating people all the time. And they're very smooth, glib talkers. I mean, it's him. He's like the best example. The other really good example historically is Casanova. And Casanova was probably the greatest pro-social psychopath of all time. I mean, I've read his 3 books, his 3 volumes. It was like 2,500 pages. It's mind-numbing. But all the stuff he does, he doesn't kill people, he doesn't rape them, but he's always seducing everybody. He's a scoundrel. And that's what Bill Clinton is. I mean, he's the closest thing we have. Now, the other people, leaders that have very high in psychopathic traits were JFK, LBJ, Teddy Roosevelt was very high with it. People who, Bill Clinton was very, very high. And young George Bush Jr. was below Bill Clinton. But George Bush Sr. had, from what people can tell, had no psychopathic traits. And neither did like Jimmy Carter. So there's a whole study done of the biographers and all the traits of the president. So they had them all ranked. But if you really look at it, I just had to ask
out of sheer curiosity, did you vote for Clinton? Do you vote for psychopaths? Is this somebody that you want running your country? I
gave a talk right before the 2016 election, and it was at an international financial group. And they asked me to do their annual talk. It was like the 30 members of the board, and the chairman of the board was a very famous senator, well known today. And they wanted to know kind of how to formulate personality types of people. And so I did it for all the presidential candidates at the time. And then I compared it to the distribution of these different traits in the population, like in Western population. And this includes types of empathy, et cetera, and how people react when they're under any strain, for economic strain or war, et cetera. So in that talk, and this was like in July or something of 2016, and I think Trump was down by like 20 or 25 points, but I based it on the traits that people who knew everybody, all the candidates had. And I said, based on this and based on the economy right now and the people, I said, Trump's got to win. And this person, the senator, who and I don't want to say his name because it'll embarrass him. Not that he cares what I said, but he came up afterwards. He says, now I know why I always vote for jerks. He's stronger language than that, but he loved it. And it was, and when Trump was elected, of course, these people on the board all called me and said, how to know that? I said, we just know the personality distribution and what happens under stressful times, what people will do. I didn't vote for Trump. For the whole year, I told everybody, I said, you don't want to vote for this guy, not because he's a psychopath, but just based on, a number of, other traits. But nonetheless, he became president. So you can kind of predict what's going to happen with people. And I know with Trump, everybody wants him to be a psychopath. There are no psychopaths talk like that. Psychopaths talk like Obama or Bill Clinton or JFK. I love you, baby. You're mine. I love you. And sweet talking. What they do is they get you to trust everything they say. And Bill Clinton quite literally can talk the pants off you, and which he did, of course.
Or talk his own pants off himself.
That's right.
To get the pants off him.
I managed to get a lot of talks on dictators, like the mind and brains of dictators, if you could scan them and do their genetics, to piece together those traits that you find in them. And I've given talks at the Human Rights Foundation and Oslo Freedom Forum, and also at various, at Tribeca, I did at Sundance, and but also I've given lectures around the world on the brains, not only of psychopaths and murderers, but also dictators, tyrants. And they all have a very similar sort of pattern of traits and a history.
What are those traits?
Well, there's a whole group of traits that line quite well with psychopathy, But then there's on top of them, there are certain ones that have they have Schadenfreude, and they're cruel, sadistic. But psychopaths, that's not a trait of psychopaths. But if you take a basic psychopathic pattern and add this sort of cruelty and Schadenfreude and some of the sociopathic, as opposed to the psychopathic sorts of traits, and then they all have a really healthy dose of narcissistic traits on top of that. And so there's a whole, you draw a Venn diagram of all these things related to cluster B personality disorders, like narcissistic personality disorder, ASPD, antisocial personality disorder, or which overlaps somewhat with psychopathy, but also histrionic and borderline. And if you look at those, there is a core group of traits that they do share, and it seems to be quite common among them. In the past couple of years, I've done a lot on Putin. So there was a PutinCon in New York City, and I did that. And I've done it in London and given that talk in Italy and other places too. And we had a series of 13 films that just came out on the Soviet system. People can watch the trailer, go to DAU.xxx, and they can see the trailer of these 13 films we did on different ways people abuse each other. There's all these different films, absolutely wild. I mean, I don't think it was done with a type of cinema verite that has never quite been done. And I acted in it. I'm not an actor, but I acted in it and there is epic mileage and footage on all these different ways that not only countries abuse each other and people, but also how girlfriends do and coworkers and men do and gays will abuse each other, and all combinations, all these films. And so it's on there. As part of that, I've given talks mostly in London, associated with the House of Commons, House of Lords, and the Royal Society of London, where I've given talks with the guy who was the head jihadist in the UK, and also with the 4 people. I ran a panel, the 4 people that broke up the Soviet Union. So it's all this stuff on different types of the way people abuse each other and all that tyranny. And it's in part psychopathy and it's in part sociopathy, which are different. But there's other, charming things like sadism added on top of some of these people. But there's a basic pattern. They have these traits, but everyone I've ever looked at, every dictator except one, was either abandoned or abused between birth and 3 years old, just like you see in these in psychopaths and many murderers. Those are fundamental type 1, psychopaths, not sociopaths. Sociopaths don't have to have the genetics. They can be abused later, bullied like when they're 8. And they're usually just really pissed off young losers getting even with the world, But psychopaths, real primary psychopaths, will recruit sociopaths to pull the trigger, to do the murders, like happened, for example, in the Beltway snipers. That was a pairing of an older psychopath with a sociopath pulling the trigger and killing people. And it's the way that now we know that this is the way that female psychopaths can work. And I think people probably can understand this. And a female usually will not do the killing themselves. They'll get some young guy who's just maybe a loser or other gals to do the killing for them. So that's the psychopath with the younger sociopath. And you find that in different political movements that are pernicious and dangerous. But the only one where we had the history of them, because I went through all these histories of the 5,000 years of dictators, and the only one that didn't was Pol Pot, where he said he had a wonderful upbringing and everybody around him did. So that's the one mystery. And he was pretty bad.
And who knows if his writing of his own tale was correct.
Of course. I mean, that's what, that's what happens with a lot of these famous serial killers. They're constantly manipulating the public, the legal system, and they'll make up a thing like pornography made me do it. They'll make up all sorts of things. It turns out to be a complete lie. And they all were came from pretty bad families, and they're all abused or abandoned between birth and 3 years old.
So although you have the possible predilections, the neurobiology, or the genetics of psychopathology, you actually had a very warm, loving upbringing, which is what you contribute to the fact that you certainly are not an actual psychopath.
Yeah, I mean, this surprised me because I was like a poster boy for genetics being the root of everything. And it turned out to be not quite that way. So I kind of had to eat some crow on this because here I had all the biological markers. I should have been just really in prison, and people knew that. But I didn't. One of these psychiatrists who did a psychoanalysis of me, in his report, his summary report, he says, here's a guy, here's a patient who has all the thoughts and drives and dreams and urges of a full-blown psychopath. He just never acts them out. So, I mean, I didn't know that, but when he had gone through with me after, a long amount of testing, he says, you have all this, the ideas and the drives and urges of like a complete psychopath, and you just don't do anything. You don't act it out. And this one question was why? And while I was writing my book, The Psychopath Inside, I did it in a mountain village, and it's a really ancient house that my friend let me use for 4 months. I typed up there. And while I was writing the book, the 2 papers came out that showed that you can have these warrior genes that are associated with high aggression and violence and in psychopaths, but a couple of them that are related to serotonin. The serotonin transporter, you can have the SLC variant, and that's one of the main out of 15 or so-called warrior genes. But 2 of these that are related to it, which I have, if you're abused or abandoned, it's really bad news. But if you're treated well, it like negates all the other stuff, right? So here's one of these bifurcating epigenetic effects, really. So I was. It was brought up so wonderfully. I really was. And I had a great family. And looking back over all the pictures from the time I was a kid, I was always laughing and being carried around by, my father and my mother, my grandparents. And I had all these wonderful aunts. I had just, even though I hung out with my father and uncles and my grandfathers, and, I love those guys. But my aunts were really something special, too. I mean, beyond that, because they were really very smart. And they treated every kid differently. They knew what everybody needed. It was just brilliant stuff. And so they knew, and my mother knew that I was a little off. So they made sure that I stayed busy constantly. Because like my mother told my teachers, don't let him be idle because something bad will happen if he's idle. So I spent all through, junior high school, and college. I just got into the habit of always being involved in some really high active sport, like, wrestling. I was in competitive wrestling, but also football, tackle football, and track and field and competitive swimming. And then in the wintertime, my favorite sport was skiing. I was a downhill racer and raced in high school and college and went to some international events. So I loved the speed and all that stuff. So I loved all these high action kind of violent sports. And I kind of just blew it all out that way. I was too exhausted every night. And when I wasn't in sports, I was in playing a musical instrument or acting or in student government. I was always busy. And it's the way it's always been. But that's because my mother knew when I was going through puberty, they said something's wrong with him. And he told, and he said, keep him busy. And I've always been busy. And when I'm not busy, that's when I can be a rascal and worse. So that was kind of the secret, it was the matriarchy, especially my mother, who was, very close to also, but she treated us all great, but all different. You know what I mean? It was 6 kids. And this is a lot of work because we had active kids.
It's a ton of work. I have one that's enough work.
A handful because they're all, to this day, very quirky, and some, active, and some people just love to fight and everything. But just for the hell of it, just for fun. And so, and I could see, and then when I talked to my mother, I said, you really manipulated the whole thing. I said, well, yeah. She goes, I'm manipulative too, but I try to do it for the good of people and not for the bad of people. And I learned that from them. They, I remember her, when we were growing up, my brothers and I were really, it doesn't look it now, but we're all good looking, really great in school and sports, and were very popular students, and with gals. We were very popular and everything. But our mother always told the guys, when you go to a dance, you got to dance with everybody before you dance with the girl you're really attracted to. So there can't be any girls there that have not danced with somebody. And she said, you can't, it's got to be convincing. You can't do it to make me, oh, you're helping somebody, like some kind of charity case. So she said, you can never do it. And our father was that way too. He was he had a business, a really active pharmaceutical business with his brother. And these guys it was in Troy, New York, and they knew all the families and what everybody, the money they had. And what they would do was adjust the price of everything. So if they knew the people were poor, they would like sell the drugs for pennies, but they'd never say you're getting a break on it. They always would get the people going, I know you're still cheating me, so they could keep their dignity. So I think from our parents on both sides were like that. They're involved in a lot of charities, but they did it quietly, or they did it so that people never felt that there were charity cases. And this was, that's a learning thing. I don't know if that's not genetic, but we all learned that. So we're all, in spite of any of the psychopathic traits, always been very heavily involved in charities to this day. And that's a funny thing about empathy. There's two main kinds of empathy. One is emotional empathy, and that's the one that people usually associate with empathy, which is emotional empathy is that when you're happy, I'm happy. When you're sad, we cry together, we laugh together. That's the emotions move with each other. The other kind is cognitive empathy. So when you see somebody crying, you don't cry. You try to help them, though. And it turns out that people with this cognitive empathy do more for charity than the people with emotional empathy. So the people who are always crying with you and everything, they rarely give money or do anything real. They do things real in the sense of they give emotional comfort. But if I know 3 people who are major, fundraisers for various large consortia, both medical, community, Hollywood, and they're all liberal Democrats, but they said to me, these people who are like supposed to be cold-hearted, mostly conservative Republicans, he said, they're the people who do all the giving. He says, well, the liberals never give anything. And it's the same sort of thing with people with the empathy, that people with emotional empathy, they rarely give much money, but they talk, it's like they talk it up. Now, what's the interesting part of this is that people with psychopathy have cognitive empathy. So they can, in fact, lead double lives, empathic lives, in that they may do all these great things for people, charities, and donate their time, but at the same time, at night, be a psychopathic killer or rapist. And it's not as contradictory as you'd think, because with these, with the people that they're preying on, they're predators, that's firewalled. Because they don't connect emotionally with those people who are suffering in that way, but they may during the day and do a lot of work. So people always think it's like a screen. It's not necessarily a screen. So there's this weird thing about these kinds of empathy and giving, and the idea of who can I find who will cry with me. And the chances are these are not people that are giving much money or their time.
But they're probably not psychopaths.
I'm sorry?
But they're probably not psychopaths.
No.
Somebody who will cry with you. It's a very, very low chance of being a psychopath if somebody's crying with you.
Well, they can do it they could do it as a guise to win your trust over. But people, you can fake empathy, but beyond that, you can firewall it in the same sense. That is, people who are psychopaths have cognitive empathy but don't have emotional empathy. It's kind of the opposite of people on the with autism or Asperger's. They're exactly opposite. So they have emotional empathy, but they don't have cognitive empathy. They don't really have the theory of mind. What are you thinking? Really, you can tell what you're feeling, but not how you're thinking. So they're kind of opposite things. But that doesn't mean that people with either thing have a disorder, because these are normal traits. Emotional empathy and cognitive empathy are are normal traits. It's just when they're combined with other things that they become pernicious, and they're epigenetically triggered early on in life to be always the same way. They're not tempered by social context. That's where it's different.
Your story is so fascinating because you're somebody who, had all these predispositions, you had a good upbringing, and so you're able to sidestep and avoid it. I wonder what through you we learn about our ability to, change our fate, change the difficult things that go on inside of us.
Yeah. Well, I had an NPR interviewer come to my house because they wanted to do a story on fixing psychopaths. And there's a really well-known psychiatric group who said that they can turn kids around and then teenagers around. But those people sent the NPR correspondent to me because they said, Fallon doesn't believe this, so get the other side. So I was sitting there, they came to my house, and this person was going to interview me. It was kind of the end of the story. They interviewed other people too. But then the next day, going up to see the star student up in LA. And this was somebody who was a psychopath who had come out of prison, was rehabilitated, and now was out, and he was going up to talk to him and his wife as to finish the story and say, see, you can reverse it. In the middle of my interview, she got a call, and she came back and sat down, and she said, I can't, there's no story here. I said, why? I said, she said, I just got a call from his wife, and he just beat the hell out of her and put her in the hospital. So, there's always this hope, and this is something, it's an old idea from I guess, French humanism, that everybody's the same. We're tabula rasa. We're born pure, and then we're affected by family, but also religion, by government. And so this is where the idea of tabula rasa, the blank slate, came from. And that has been a consistent sort of controlling idea from Aristotle on forward, Avicenna, Aristotle, and a whole group of philosophers, and all the way through, especially in the 20th century, post-World War II. And it's dominated all of our humanities and social sciences and psychology, is this idea of tabula rasa. Opposing this idea was one that Plato came up with, and also supported by Thomas Hobbes. So there's nobody was thinking this way, that you're born with a whole set of moral codes that's genetically wired. They didn't, Plato didn't say genetics, but it was an internal thing. You're kind of born with these programs, these very essential programs. Well, over the past 10 years of new biological psychiatry and studies of personality disorders and, different studies of morality and ethics, we now know that Plato is correct and everybody else has been wrong. So, people are not born with a blank slate, and some people are born genetically that, like you said, with resilience. Others do not have resilience. And so there are some kids that are genetically wired to be very resilient. And, these people fall down the stairs when they're 2 years old. They get up laughing. You can't get to them. And where there are other people are very susceptible. So it's not everybody susceptible. If you have the susceptibility genes for these personality disorders, and you are, abandoned or abused between birth and 3, this is the deadly combination of epigenetics. But outside of that, it's maybe only 25% of the people are affected by this because they're genetically wired, and then they're triggered with this. But in most people, it's temporary. So that's why we have people with real personality disorders like psychopathy, primary psychopathy, and it's pretty permanent because those systems are pretty hardwired. They're myelinated systems that connect these areas of the social brain, the limbic system. And they're not like these other plastic systems. When people say, well, the brain is plastic, well, they're mostly talking about the monoamine systems, which is what are owned by the drug companies. This is where all the money is made.
MEOs, yep. And
so what you're doing is, these plastic systems, which are always plastic, are dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, epinephrine, histamine. And these are what are plastic. But these other those are unmyelinated. There's no coating on those axons. So they make connections, they pop off, they're always moving around. But the other things that are the basis of real personality traits, and when it goes wrong, these are hardwired systems. They're hardwired early different stages of development in the orbital cortex, and that connection with the amygdala. And I had looked with fMRIs, or just MRIs, not fMRIs, of infants, and you could see this thing developing very early. You use diffusion tensor imaging to look at pre-myelination, early myelination, but these are developing from birth to 3, and once they're myelinated, you're it. That's it. Now, people say, well, there's plasticity because it's part of that romantic appeal. It's going back to the old French humanism thing, like where, no, everybody can be changed if you only, and no, they can't. And I have not seen a true psychopath ever get out of the joint and get treated where they're permanently fixed. Everybody can be, everybody goes on diets on January 1st. Everybody can make a resolution to act better. I mean, if you're part of a church, like Catholics go to confession every week, and Christians and Jews, all the Abrahamic religions, there's always this sort of not only communion, but there's being absolved of your sins each day and over each year by your creator, or an intermediary. Well, if you keep having the same sins, they're not sins. This is psychopathy. But people, it's easier to have a behavior that's a sin because you can be forgiven for it by your creator. Psychopathy ain't going away. So the idea, people will say all the time, I can change. People can change. Well, you can change temporarily. People change temporarily all the time. It's like watching Oprah lose and gain weight. This is a woman with great willpower, but she ends up putting the weight back on. She has a certain genetic wiring for obesity, and she's got to fight this. People with addictions have the same sort of thing. There are people who can fight it because every day they can fight an addiction or fight a behavior, but every day they got to think about it. And once they don't, they snap right back to their wiring. So there are that group of people, 5% of people who do change, but they've got to think about it every day. It's not just something you do a couple exercises with, because everybody always snaps back. It's just, I think this is a common knowledge, but we're often in denial about this.
So there are, you look at a long-term meditator, for example, and you see real changes in the brain. You see changes in the prefrontal cortex. You see downregulation of the amygdala. You even see a decrease in size of the amygdala. There's an indication that a practice like that, when done regularly, makes real change in the brain, and you see the corollary behavioral changes and personality changes in the individual, the way they act, the way they react, the way they think and they feel.
Yeah, I mean, people can do it. They can say, I'm going to change myself, or I have a therapist, they're going to change, and they will change for days, weeks, months, even a few years. But just like Oprah, they go back to what they're kind of wired to be. I mean, it's just you see it constantly. I rarely have ever seen somebody permanently, or even for a long term, 10 years, really that change their behavior, unless they're doing something every day to concentrate on it. But there are all these parallel connectomes in the brain. There are many ways to solve problems. Like in math, females they have more pathways to come to the same answer. So you get, as males, which tend to have fewer ways of solving problems, even though they have the same end result. But there's all these, and so there's this sexual dimorphism of difference in brain connectivity between genders, and so but we know that there are multiple pathways. So what seems to be plasticity can be somebody just switching over and using a pathway they already have, but now it's just another way to solve the problem, okay, and to deal with it. So you activate another thing that's already there. It may seem like you created a new pathway, but you're just strengthening and weakening certain ones. And unless you keep at it, they all seem to snap back. It's not something you can just fix. Just like dieting, really. You don't automatically just fix it. And all addictions, you see the same thing. People are, not everybody, but the people that do are always every day, daily concentrating on this, changing themselves. So it can be done. 5% of people, something like that.
And hence the need to meditate every day, to literally concentrate every day.
You have to do something every day, and that way you can concentrate. So in many ways, all the different modalities can work if you can stay with it. But a lot of people, they have to change their whole life in that sense, right?
Obviously, the psychopathology angle is really interesting because as somebody who meditates, what you're thinking about is, how do I quiet my mind, gain control of my mind, create a more peaceful mind and universe through this practice. And here we have this characterization, which is entirely the opposite of what we're going for. And, is that something, obviously you had these predilections and you were able to use all of the positive constructs that we understand, love and support, to tame your own mind unwittingly. So I think,
I think, well, I mean, I can just tell you my experiences that are probably related somewhat to meditation and mind quieting and such things. When I was doing my postdoctoral research at University of California, San Diego, Reginald Bickford he studied all these gurus and yogis and was in meditation, and did a lot of quantitative EEG at the time. That was years ago, but he was like really quite into the neurobiology of meditation. So he brought all these yogis in from all over the world and tested them. And he was right down the hall from us. I only knew him because our labs were next to each other, and I wasn't doing any work like that. But his postdoc came down to my office. They said they're almost done with the study, and they needed some negative controls. What do you mean? They said, well, meditation is about quieting the mind and all this. And he said, and it goes with certain behaviors and activities that we associate with it. And he said, you're the opposite. He says, so we need you as a negative control. He said, you're a partier, you smoke, you drink, you go crazy, you're hypomanic, and you're all, you are like a party guy. You're the opposite of what we're looking for. So anyway, they wired me up for a couple of days. I went into a kind of an isolation tank. It was a Faraday cage. It was all, completely sound isolated. And I went in there for a couple of days and laid there. And they said, open your eyes, close your eyes, do all this. Imagine you're doing this and that. And in the second day, I even though it was soundproof, I could hear them laughing. And they were just going crazy. They were laughing like crazy out there. When I finally came out, they said, I said, what was all the laughter about? He said, well, actually, come back in 3 days and look on the wall in the medical school. And so I went back there, and they had printouts of my EEG. So they had the, they looked at alpha and beta, gamma, but they're focused mostly on alpha at the time for those correlates. And they said that your alpha is 10 times the voltage of anybody we've ever had. And so we've had people in from the yogis in from India and, Tibet and like Tibetan masters and all this stuff. And he says, you just have that naturally. He said, when you close your eyes, he said, do you meditate? I said, no, I have no idea what meditation is. He says, you meditate so often you don't know it, because when you close your eyes, you're gone, man. He says, you're meditating when you blink almost.
That alpha block.
Huh?
The alpha block, when you close your eyes and your alpha goes up, that's called the alpha block.
Yeah. And it was, so they said, and they said, and they asked me, well, what do you do when you're laying in there? And I said, close your eyes. And so as soon as I close my eyes, what usually happens is I start to be enveloped by a light. I can do that right now if I wanted to. It's something I think I started to get. It's my first memory every night. When I closed my eyes, I saw this kind of silver blue shimmering light in my eyes were closed. It was kind of vibrating. And then over the period of about, I would say 45 seconds or so, it would start to condense into this really intense blue-white light. And then as soon as it got there, it would then come zapping right and hit me right here, and it would go ping. And it was all I could think of at the time, because I always remember it as being, it seemed like it was extraordinary weight. You would say like it's infinite mass, but it was light as a feather. So it touched me, just go bing, and it felt great. So it's my oldest, I think my earliest memory. And every night when I went to sleep, many times that's what I do. And it would happen automatically when I close my eyes. And I do that. I've done it for years because I love water, and so I'm just a water person. I've always been a water person. And I'll go down. I remember it's a wonderful sense. I went out to the Colorado River in the middle of the night with some friends. They were fishing and drinking, and I just jumped in the water and floated down in the middle of the river. This was down below the dam. And I was like zooming around. I lifted out of the water and I was just up in the sky, flying around. So this was a very common experience to me. And they said, well, so you're really kind of meditating there. And then when I had it done by, Dr. Eugene, who was a psychiatrist, you know him well. When he did it, he said that all of your alpha is focused at one frequency. It's a point frequency. It's very, very high voltage, and it's a point. And so it's like a completely coherent, and it's spread over almost your entire brain. So when he mapped it out, then he did my wife and our kids. And our kids had the exact same thing as me. My wife is noisy, and when we showed her, the kind of the color rendition of it, there's nothing there. She goes, my mind's blank. So he goes, no. He says, you're just always talking to yourself. Your mind is so busy all the time, and which is true. It is constantly going. With us, my kids and I, as it turns out, we close our eyes, we're like gone, and nothing is, it's like completely floating around. And the only difference in our EEGs is that my son and I were both left-handed, so there's one spot, the premotor and motor cortex, that's opposite to our daughter, and she's right-handed. So it really is kind of internal consistency with it. But we have the same thing. And so a geneticist and another psychiatrist we know said, well, this is this is absolutely genetic. It's got to be genetics. None of you know about meditation or anything, but it's the same pattern. And so then we plan to do some genetic studies with us all. We still have the data on the glutamate receptors and things in cortex that would allow this to happen. And so my experience with EEG is that, and it's associated with something very primitive that I don't control. Well, I can control it. All I got to do is say, okay, I'm going to close my eyes, and when I close my eyes,
it magically happens.
Flying around, and it'll automatically happen. So I can control it. My daughter, my son, and I don't know what we're doing, but it just happens automatically. And we've been told that it's like, you immediately start meditating when you just almost blink. Anyway.
I wonder if somebody put you into an MRI and looked at your default mode network, if that would also be downregulated. Because there's a bunch of different neural correlates of meditation.
We did PET scanning on and off with and without a task. And you could see the default mode. Mine is very very much focused on the precuneus, the medial occipital-parietal cortex, a very intense signal. But then also with the dorsal prefrontal cortex. So if you look at it, I have very little activity, both at rest and activation with those stimuli that have to do with emotional empathy or showing me like really awful pictures. I just know there's almost no response. But what I have my whole ventral cortical limbic system is turned off, the orbital cortex, ventromedial cortex, anterior cingulate, as well as spots in the amygdala. So it's when you do the HRRT type PET scan, it's a very high resolution. So you can see this, it's like a mosaic of hot spots and cold spots. So overall, it's colder, the amygdala too. But there are these hot spots that are not seen in an average person, I guess. And so that sort of pattern, which is no activity ventrally, in my dorsal system, that is the dorsal cortical system extends from occipital, parietal, premotor, prefrontal. That whole area is like really turned on, and it has to do, it's associated with executive function and being in the here and now, right? That is, it's you and I are talking to each other, and we know that we're talking to each other, and that sense of knowing, explicitly knowing we're talking to each other, and we're thinking about what each other is thinking, probably at 2 or 3 or 4 levels. What's the thought behind it? All of that stuff is like really turned on, and it's that way in my kids too. Mine is like really completely turned on, while the whole ventral system is really turned off. So my mind's pathological. There's is not pathological that way. That's where we differ. They have a sort of a normal limbic system activation and default, but I don't. That's where we separate. You have one genetic-based trait. To fight that, you fight it your whole life, and it can be beaten. But you better have something every day where you're constantly, you're doing that. I mean, the way I have to fight it is I go through a whole procedure to improve my behavior with other people. So I have a method that I have to do and remind myself. I have to cognitively, explicitly say, I am now going to do this. I'm going to now be a nice person.
And how do you do that? What's your method?
Well, I started with, maybe 4 years ago after I got all these tests back and everything. And I said, I tried to harness my own narcissism and saying, you can't beat this. You can't beat psychopathy, these traits, but I can do it because I'm that good, So I try to harness my own ego and my own disease, if you will. And so what I did was I started with my wife and I said, I have to look at every behavior. So I started looking at people in my position, guys my age who have kids and then grandkids, and see what they actually did when people weren't watching. And I studied them for about a month, all my different people I know, and I knew their behaviors in detail. And I really started to notice that when people weren't watching, they were really sacrificing themselves for people, not just their wife and their kids, but other people too. And it's something I wouldn't naturally do, I was going to help somebody and say, hey, I'm not going to help you, I'd let them know, but they weren't doing that. So I said, aha. So every day I would start and wake up and my wife and I do little things that good roommates do, good friends do. I would, make the breakfast. I'd wash up after myself, pour her wine first, all these very little things. And then larger things that people will do. You're supposed to go to funerals of your wife's family. Somebody in your family dies. You're not supposed to make up an excuse and say, I can't do that, and then go down to a beach bar all day instead of going to which I would do. So I was doing these things, not to hurt somebody, but I'd blow things off. Well, I started doing all those things. And I've tried to do that. And after about a couple of months, she goes, what has come over you? And I said, what do you mean? She goes, well, you're really like a really nice guy now. Not just a fun, interesting guy, but a nice, really good guy.
Finally acting like a mensch.
Yeah, like a mensch, like a regular, but a way that wasn't going out of my way, but what I thought was normative behavior for normal, like a regular good guy or a good gal. I mean, and I said, don't take it seriously. It's just an experiment. I'm seeing if I can change this. And she says, I don't care if it's an experiment and it's not sincere. I just like you treating me better. And I went, what? That would really surprise me that she didn't care. And I started it with other people and they noticed too. And so, but I have to ask myself, what would a good guy do in this circumstance? And I was doing that 30 times a day and I was doing selfish things every time. So in fighting that, what I found it is very hard to be a good guy, really, and like a mensch. This first thing. And the second thing is I was started to sleep longer and longer. I was exhausted by this. And so since college, I've always slept just like 4 hours, 3.5, 4 hours a night. I don't sleep much. I have never needed sleep. And I started to sleep like 5 hours, 6 hours, because it was just exhausting. So it was like really hard and exhausting to be a good guy. And now I know I'm still doing it because I'm sleeping longer. To me, we've done a lot of sleep studies, so I know a fair amount about sleep. But it's exhausting being a good guy and a good person, you know what I mean, a thoughtful person, because I'm not naturally wired that way. I'm not saying it's my genes, but that's my regular behavior is like a Bill Clinton. Just see what you can get away with, kind of thing. It'd be glib and, you'd walk into a room and all that kind of stuff. And I know two people who work very closely with the Clintons, like very closely, and they completely supported this whole idea about, especially about Bill. Hillary's a different person, but Bill is like completely this way. And it's that swagger. And there's that group of traits is these positive traits that people are very attracted to, which is why we keep, voting these people into office. We vote, we buy things from them. It's this group of traits. It's called fearless dominance. It's when you walk through the room and you got that light around you. People interpret this as charisma. And this is what psychopaths have. And so, you know, and it's just almost every psychopath has that, the positive trait, the ones with positive traits. There are some psychopaths that have just negative traits and they're just complete jerks. Everybody hates them. But these positive ones, they get away with anything. And we vote them into all sorts of position of power, and they seduce people constantly. Yeah, that's just, we're wired to interpret that behavior as he must be a good guy. And, you know, it's like you see a lot of that. It's like run the other way.
But what we've learned from you is that it's actually possible to change your behavior. So I think this is a fascinating lesson for everybody, because most of us don't actually stop to analyze our own behavior and say, hey, am I doing the right thing? What would a really good person do right now? Because we just all sort of assume we're good people. So, you know, there's a fascinating lesson to learn about positive social interaction from a potential psychopath.
Yeah, just takes daily work.
This was an incredible interview. Thank you very, very much.
Well, good talking to you again, and I hope this works.
This is fantastic. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Lots of fun. Have a great night.
Okay, you too.
Total
Bye,
pleasure.